Hey guys, tonight we begin with a fun and terrible thought. Why you would unlast a minute on a medieval battlefield. Sink into your pillows, dim the lights, and drift with me into a world where armor was heavy, strategy messy, and death often came from dust or disease rather than sword alone. You see, when we imagine medieval battles, we picture clashing swords, heroic last stands, banners flying, but that's mostly fantasy. The everyday truth was uglier, slower, and far less glamorous, especially for the people in the ranks, the foot soldiers, the conscripts, the ones whose names became dust. If you found yourself transported, no helmet, no modern medical care, your odds of survival would be shockingly low. You'd face mud, hunger, exposure, disease, and a bunch of people swinging axes at you. It wasn't heroic. It was grindy, grimy, and exhausting. Now, let's gently walk. Yes, walk. There was no charging gallop, except in stories, into what life was really like for an average soldier. First, the campaign itself. Walking for days over rough roads, through forests, across rivers, carrying heavy gear, steel helmet, chainmail, or padded gambeson shield, weapons, maybe a pack. Your feet would ache, blisters forming, rain would soak through, cold would creep in. And all the while, the specter of raids, ambushes, and late-night attacks loomed silently. Food was scarce. You might get salted meat, hard bread, porridge, sometimes nothing. Supplies had to follow armies, and often they didn't. In many medieval campaigns, starvation or disease killed more men than swords did. Camps were crowded and unsanitary. Latrines hastily dug, water polluted, rats everywhere. Wounds got infected. People died from dysentery, typhus, or simply from complications of injuries. The filthy environment was a mortal enemy just as much as a lance or arrow. When battle came, most men didn't see glory. They saw fear. They saw chaos. The front lines were brutal. Those in the first ranks took most of the blows. Many would try to flee in the first panic. Some died stepping on each other. The noise, metal clashing, war cries, trumpets, horses, could be terrifying even without being hit. If you were lucky, you'd get struck in the arm, fall, be trampled, or cut. If luck was really on your side, you'd be captured, ransomed, or maybe flee. But lasting a minute? Unlikely. Even knights and nobles took huge risks. About 30% of noblemen died in battle before 1550. High prestige, high danger. The psychological weight was enormous. Watching comrades die, smelling blood and fear, hearing moans. Sleep was rare. Rest was shallow. And when night fell, many survivors prayed they'd wake to fight another day. So yeah, spoiler alert, you almost certainly wouldn't last a minute. But the people who did survive, who made it through day after day, they changed warfare, society, and history itself. All right, let's drift a little deeper into the noise, the smell of sweat, rust, and panic. Because here's the thing, medieval battles weren't cinematic duels under clear skies. They were loud, chaotic piles of humans in metal, trying not to die. Let's start with armor. Everyone imagines knights in full shining plate, glinting in sunlight. The truth. Most soldiers wore whatever they could find or afford, often just padded cloth or a bit of chainmail if they were lucky. That padded tunic, the gambeson, could soak up sweat, mud, and blood until it weighed as much as a toddler. Under the summer sun, it was like fighting inside a damp oven. Under rain, it became a sponge, and those perfect metal suits you see in museums, those were custom-made luxuries for the elite few. The average knight looked more like a rusting tank, dense, mismatched pieces, straps about to snap. It worked, but barely. And yes, it stank. Medieval armor wasn't polished for show. It was practical. Most soldiers probably smelled like wet dogs wrapped in iron. Now, imagine wearing that for hours. Your vision limited by a slit, breathing through holes. Each swing of your sword feels like dragging a log through molasses. It's hot, noisy, and you're terrified. That's not heroism. That's endurance. Let's not forget weapons. They weren't precision tools. Swords were often heavy and unbalanced. Spears were long and maces broke bones through armor, and bows, well, long bows were great, but pulling one took enormous strength. Archers trained from childhood to get that power. Most of us today would pull once and immediately regret every life choice leading up to that moment. Then there were the horses. We like to picture gallant charges, shining steeds, banners waving. In reality, horses were often panicked by sound, blood, or even the smell of death. A war horse was trained, yes, but they still slipped, screamed, and sometimes trampled their own riders. You wouldn't be charging nobly into battle. You'd be clinging for dear life, praying your horse didn't decide to run sideways into a ditch. And the tactics. Oh, they weren't clever. They were repetitive. Shield walls, pike formations, mass charges. Whoever broke formation first usually lost. Armies often lined up, yelled a lot, and crashed together like a very deadly rugby scrum. You couldn't see who you were hitting. Half the time, you didn't even know if it was friend or foe. The real nightmare came after the first few minutes. Once fatigue set in, soldiers started slipping, tripping on corpses, losing their grip. The front lines turned into a human traffic jam of panic and blood. And if you fell down, that was it. No one helped you up. They couldn't even see you. You'd just vanish under the tide. And after all that chaos, when one side finally broke and ran, that's when the killing really started. Armies chased the losers down, cutting them from behind. Running away in armor was almost impossible. Imagine sprinting in a 60-pound sauna suit. You'd either fall or suffocate before anyone even caught you. It's easy to think, I'd survive if I hid. But even hiding wasn't safe. Stragglers were hunted, captured, or killed for sport. And if by some miracle you stumbled away alive, bleeding, limping, dehydrated, you'd still face disease, hunger, and infection. No, the battlefield didn't end when the battle did. It kept echoing, in wounds that wouldn't heal, in screams you couldn't forget. The living carried it home, in their bodies and minds. Let's float a little further now, beyond the clash and the dust, into what happened when the fighting stopped. Because if you think peace meant comfort, well, medieval medicine had other plans. So, you've somehow made it through a medieval battle. Congratulations. You're alive, technically. You're covered in mud. Your ears are ringing. And your arm probably isn't bending the way it should. But don't relax just yet, because surviving the battle was only the first test. Now comes the really fun part, medieval medicine. Let's start with this comforting fact. Doctors in the Middle Ages didn't actually understand infection. Germ theory wouldn't show up for another 500 years. So when a knight took a sword to the leg, the main concern wasn't bacteria. It was, how's your blood balance? You see, medicine back then ran on the four humors theory: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Everything was about keeping those four liquids in harmony. If you were injured, it clearly meant your humors were out of balance. The solution: bleed more, or vomit, or both. Because apparently the body was just a medieval plumbing problem, waiting to be drained. Surgeons, and that term is generous, were usually barbers or battlefield assistants. Their tools, whatever was sharp and nearby. They'd use knives, heated irons, or saws that definitely weren't sterilized. Anesthetics were optional, and by optional, I mean non-existent. You might get a bit of strong ale or bite down on a stick. Lucky you. If your wound got infected, and it almost always did, they might apply honey, cobwebs, or moldy bread, which sounds weirdly familiar, since moldy bread does contain penicillin. Centuries before anyone knew why it sometimes worked. But that was pure luck, not science. Broken bones, set with wooden splints tied tight enough to stop blood flow, arrows stuck in your body. They'd either yank it out by hand or, in some cases, push it the rest of the way through. Yes, you heard that right. The quickest way out is through. Very inspiring words, until you're the one being used as the demonstration. And let's not even talk about amputations. Those were done in tents, fast and brutal. Because if the surgeon hesitated, you might die from shock. Hot irons were used to cauterize the wound, partly to stop bleeding, mostly to make sure everyone in the camp could hear you screaming. But the real danger came after. Even if you didn't bleed out, infection crept in silently. Gangrene was almost inevitable. Antibiotics didn't exist, so once the rot started, your only hope was prayer. And even prayer wasn't sterile. Now, let's imagine you got lucky. You're patched up, hobbling home, trying to rebuild your life. You've got scars, nightmares, maybe a missing limb. Welcome to the glamorous life of a veteran. Because medieval society didn't have pensions, therapy, or prosthetics. You were just done. Soldiers who couldn't fight anymore often turned to begging, banditry, or monastery life. And considering most people at the time believed physical wounds reflected moral flaws, being visibly scarred didn't earn you much sympathy. Even knights, the supposed elite warriors, weren't immune. Many came back from war bankrupt, because equipping yourself for battle cost a fortune. Armor, horses, weapons, all privately funded. If you lost them in war, that was it. You might return a hero, but heroes still had debts. And emotionally, well, medieval chroniclers didn't have words for trauma, but you can see it between the lines. Knights confessing nightmares, monks writing about soldiers who wandered at night, unable to find rest. The trauma was real, even if they didn't name it. So yes, you could survive a medieval battle, but you wouldn't walk away unchanged. You'd be scarred, both inside and out, limping through a world that wasn't built to help you heal. Let's drift a little further now, away from blood and bandages, to another brutal truth about medieval warfare, who actually fought, and why they didn't have much of a choice. Let's take a breath, stretch our bruised limbs, and drift into the quieter side of medieval warfare, the people behind the chaos. Because while history loves to talk about knights in shining armor and kings on horseback, the truth is that most of the people on those battlefields were regular folks who didn't really want to be there. The romantic image of noble knights charging into glory, that was maybe 2% of the army, the top-tier professionals, the influencers of the 14th century. The rest were farmers, blacksmiths, millers, and teenagers who got drafted because they happened to live near a feudal lord who needed volunteers. Feudal obligation was a lovely system where your landlord could suddenly decide that rent this year meant showing up to war with your own pitchfork. You were expected to bring your own gear, maybe a knife, a bit of leather armor if you were lucky, and a good pair of shoes. Not that the shoes would last long, but it's the thought that counts. And if you were a peasant archer in England, congratulations. You had one of the most effective weapons of the era, the longbow. You could pierce armor from hundreds of feet away. The downside, using a longbow from childhood permanently warped your skeleton. Archaeologists have found the remains of medieval archers with shoulders and arms twisted from years of practice. So yes, you could win a battle, but your spine might look like a question mark by 30. Now, most battles weren't the epic cinematic clashes you imagine. They were hours of chaos, mud, and shouting. Commanders could barely control their men once the fighting started, and communication, forget it. There were no radios, just flags, horns, and frantic hand gestures. It's honestly a miracle anyone knew who was winning. And speaking of winning, what did that even mean? If your side managed to hold the field at the end of the day, you won, but you probably lost half your friends, your lord's favorite horse, and maybe your sense of hearing from all the clashing metal. If you lost, well, you either ran or were captured. Captured knights were lucky. They could be ransomed. Their families or lords would pay to get them back. Common soldiers, though, no one was wiring gold for them. You'd be stripped of anything valuable, maybe enslaved, maybe executed. Depends on the mood of the victor. Let's not forget the camp followers, the invisible half of every medieval army. These were the women, merchants, and servants who followed soldiers from battle to battle, cooking, washing clothes, selling supplies, or patching wounds. They lived in the mud too, often just outside the camp walls. Some were wives, others widows, and many simply trying to survive in a world that didn't have better options. Disease ran through these camps faster than gossip. Dysentery, typhoid, the plague, you name it. More soldiers died from sickness than from swords. A victorious army could lose thousands to bad water or spoiled meat weeks after the fighting stopped. And while all this was happening, the lords and commanders were usually back in their tents, arguing over who deserved the most glory. They might never even touch a sword. They'd write letters about valiant deeds, while someone else cleaned the blood off their armor. There was also the weather. Medieval Europe wasn't kind to its soldiers. Rain turned fields into swamps. Summer heat baked metal armor until knights fainted inside their helmets. Winter campaigns froze men in their sleep. The romantic idea of chivalry didn't cover frostbite, trenchfoot, or lice infestations. But the weirdest part, despite all this, people kept fighting. Generation after generation, the wars went on over borders, dynasties, faith, pride. Most didn't even know why they were there beyond the Lord said so. So next time you imagine yourself as a brave medieval warrior, just remember, you're probably a hungry farmer holding a rusted spear, ankle deep in mud, hoping your helmet doesn't fall off while arrows whistle overhead. Let's drift onward into the strange world of knights themselves. The men who supposedly lived and died by a code of honor that sounded noble on parchment, but looked a lot different in practice. Alright, let's talk about the knights, those shiny, dramatic figures who've been romanticized into near myth. You know, the ones who supposedly rescued damsels, fought for honor, and looked majestic on horseback. In reality, they were more like heavily armed landowners who occasionally remembered to pray before setting something on fire. Knighthood in the Middle Ages wasn't so much a profession as a lifestyle choice for the very rich. Armor wasn't cheap. A full suit of plate armor in the late medieval period could cost as much as a small farm, which means if you were wearing one, you either inherited money, conquered it, or married into it. And yes, the armor looked impressive, but it was far from practical. A full suit could weigh around 60 pounds. That's like carrying a middle schooler on your back while trying to fight for your life. You couldn't exactly sprint or climb icily. If you fell off your horse into the mud, you might need 3 squires and divine intervention to stand back up. Contrary to myth, though knights could move, the armor was well fitted and jointed. But after an hour of swinging swords and dodging spears, even the best trained knight was basically a slow-cooking stew inside a tin can. Now, people love to talk about the code of chivalry, this supposedly noble rulebook about bravery, courtesy, and protecting the weak. It sounds poetic, right? Except most knights treated it like a vague suggestion. The same man who swore to defend the innocent might spend next week burning a rival's village to the ground. Chivalry was more PR slogan than actual lifestyle. The training for knighthood started early. Boys from noble families were sent away around age 7 to serve as pages, basically fancy servants, for more powerful lords. They cleaned armor, ran errands, and learned how to behave around nobles. By 14, if they were lucky and coordinated, they became squires, which meant holding real weapons and attending real battles, usually as glorified assistants. They learned to ride, joust, and stab in formation. They also learned court manners, because apparently, being able to politely insult someone before decapitating them was a valued skill. If they survived training and earned favor, they'd be dubbed knights in a formal ceremony, the medieval version of graduation, complete with prayers, feasts, and probably a hangover. After that, life was a mix of tournaments, wars, and estate management. Tournaments. The medieval version of professional sports, except the players occasionally died mid-game. The idea was to train for real combat while entertaining the crowd, but tournaments quickly turned into expensive pageants. Nobles flaunted their armor, banners, and horses. The goal wasn't survival, it was showing off. And then there was jousting. 2 men charging at each other with lances while trying not to break their necks. Sounds fun, right? Injuries were constant. Concussions, broken ribs, and internal bleeding were practically part of the show. King Henry II of France literally died in a jousting accident in 1559 when a splintered lance pierced his skull. So yes, sometimes the fun killed you. But behind the pageantry, knights were brutal enforcers. When their lords called, they fought in wars that rarely benefited anyone below them. They raided villages, captured enemies for ransom, and sometimes switched sides mid-conflict if the pay was better. Even the church tried to keep them in check with movements like the Peace of God and Truce of God, which basically told knights, please stop murdering peasants and raiding on Sundays. It worked about as well as you'd expect, meaning not at all. And for all their honor, knights were obsessed with reputation. They kept heraldry, symbols, and coats of arms to prove who they were in battle, because dying anonymously was considered worse than losing. So, yes, being a knight meant prestige, but it also meant debt, exhaustion, and an early grave. For every shining hero in a story, there were hundreds of lesser-known knights buried nameless under the mud of some forgotten field. Let's glide now from the knights in their armor to the ones who really made the medieval battlefield work, the horses, because without them, chivalry would have been a lot less glamorous and a lot more walking. Let's talk about the real unsung heroes of medieval warfare, the horses. The mighty war horses, or destriers, that carried knights into chaos, mud, and glory. You've seen them in movies, tall, muscular beasts charging through arrows and smoke like tanks with hooves. And yes, they were impressive, but also expensive, temperamental, and occasionally homicidal. A good warhorse could cost a small fortune, almost as much as the armor it carried. These animals weren't your average farm horses. They were bred for power, speed, and endurance. Think of them as medieval Ferraris, flashy, dangerous, and extremely high maintenance. Knights pampered them with the kind of care most peasants couldn't dream of. Grooming, feeding, specialized training, all of it meticulously done, because a knight without a horse was basically a pedestrian in an expensive outfit. Training a war horse was an art form. They were taught to kick, bite, and trample on command. Yes, war horses were weaponized. They learned to charge into enemy lines, ignore noise and blood, and even use their bodies to crush opponents. Imagine the kind of trust or mutual trauma that required between rider and horse. And these weren't gentle rides. When a cavalry charge hit, it was like a wall of moving steel, slamming into flesh and bone. Horses could break spears, scatter infantry, and create panic, which was often their real purpose. Medieval battles weren't always about slaughter. They were about breaking morale. And nothing quite breaks morale like 100 screaming knights thundering toward you. Of course, horses weren't invincible. Arrows, pikes, and muddy terrain could easily stop them. That's why knights preferred open, dry fields, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. But warfare rarely respected ideal conditions. More often than not, you and your expensive horse were knee-deep in sludge, slipping and gasping, while peasants with sharp sticks tried to make history out of your misery. Then there was the other side of the horse equation, the foot soldiers who had to face them, to stand in formation, holding a spear or pike, and wait for a charging wall of muscle and iron. That took a special kind of courage, or maybe a lack of options. Many of these men were conscripts, farmers pressed into service by lords who needed more bodies in the line. Their training, minimal. Their armor, a thick coat and a prayer. The most disciplined among them used long spears, forming what was called a pike square. Picture a human hedgehog bristling with wooden spikes. It was one of the few ways to counter a cavalry charge. Hold the line, plant the pikes, and hope the horses stopped before turning everyone into jam. But not every soldier got a pike. Some had short swords, axes, or even improvised tools. The infantry were the true backbone of medieval warfare, but they got none of the glamour. They were dirty, tired, and often underfed. Many didn't even have shoes. And yet, slowly, over centuries, these humble soldiers started changing the game. Battles like Courtrai in 1302 or Bannockburn in 1314 proved that disciplined infantry, especially pikemen and longbowmen, could defeat heavily armored knights. The myth of invincible cavalry began to crack. The longbow, in particular, became the medieval equivalent of a sniper rifle. English archers could shoot arrows up to 250 yards with terrifying precision. Trained from childhood, their draw strength was so great that skeletons of longbowmen showed deformed shoulders and twisted spines, permanent marks of lifelong archery. Their arrows pierced armor, their volleys darkened skies, and their discipline shattered noble arrogance. It was one of those beautiful medieval ironies. The peasant with a bow could kill the knight who once taxed his village. Of course, the knights didn't take this well. For them, dying at the hands of a farmer with a stick and string was unthinkable. But warfare doesn't care about pride. The longbowmen at Crécy and Agincourt proved that social class was no defense against physics. So, while the knights wrote songs about honor and glory, the peasants rewrote the rules of war, one arrow at a time. Let's drift from the chaos of battle now to what came after the wounds, the medicine, and the questionable science that tried to keep medieval soldiers alive. Because surviving a fight was only the beginning of your problems. Let's imagine for a moment that you've somehow survived the chaos. The shouting has faded, the smell of iron and smoke still lingers in the air, and you're standing barely in the aftermath of a medieval battlefield. Your armor's dented, your sword is chipped, and your body feels like it's been beaten with every blunt object in Europe. You should feel lucky to be alive. But now comes the truly painful part. Medieval medicine. Medicine in this era was a strange mix of guesswork, superstition, and creative optimism. The best-trained doctors of the time firmly believed that the human body ran on from magical fluids called humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick or injured, that meant your humors were unbalanced. The solution? You had to get rid of some of them. Cue the bloodletting. It didn't matter what your problem was, fever, headache, or just bad vibes. The treatment was the same. Take some blood out. Sometimes they'd use knives, sometimes leeches. And when the patient fainted halfway through, the physician would nod wisely and say, "Ah yes, the humors are realigning." It was basically medieval science's version of turning it off and on again. And it wasn't just physicians handling this sort of thing. Barbers, yes, the same men who cut your hair and shaved your beard, were also part-time surgeons. The famous red and white barber pole actually symbolizes blood and bandages. You could walk in for a haircut and walk out missing a tooth or a cyst. No gloves, no sterilization, just a cheerful next. If you were lucky enough to end up in a monastery infirmary, you might have stood a better chance. Monks tended gardens full of medicinal herbs and followed ancient recipes copied from dusty Latin manuscripts. They believed in healing both the body and the soul. So you might get a poultice of crushed sage and honey, followed by a few hours of prayer to make sure your sins weren't causing your infection. It was holistic medicine in the truest sense. Half biology, half theology. On the battlefield, things got darker. Imagine you've been hit by an arrow. You can't move your leg. The surgeon arrives, no anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a knife, some wine, and strong opinions about pain tolerance. He might try to cut out the arrowhead with a heated blade, or if that failed, simply amputate the entire limb. The wine wasn't for cleaning the wound, it was for helping him forget your screams later. If you survived the surgery, the odds were still against you. Wounds got packed with herbs, honey, or occasionally animal dung. The idea was that it drew out bad spirits. What it actually did was introduce about 1 million new bacterial friends. And yet, somehow, some people lived. The human body is annoyingly good at not dying. The strange thing is that medieval medicine wasn't entirely nonsense. Honey really does have antibacterial properties. Certain herbs like willow bark reduced pain. Even trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to relieve pressure, occasionally worked. They had no idea why it helped, but sometimes, accidentally, it did. Still, most treatment was a mix of luck, prayer, and endurance. Illness was often seen as divine punishment or a test from God, so a priest might be called in to bless the patient, sprinkle some holy water, and remind them that pain was good for the soul. Comforting, in theory. Horrifying, in practice. And for soldiers who survived their wounds, there wasn't much in the way of aftercare. No pensions, no therapy, no rehabilitation. Many became beggars or lifelong cripples, wandering from town to town, carrying the marks of battle like unwanted souvenirs. Some even returned to fight again, hobbling into the next war because fighting, brutal as it was, was the only thing they knew how to do. By then the armor that once protected them had rusted, the swords had dulled, and the glory of war had turned into something quieter. The stubborn will to keep living in a world that didn't much care if you did. It was survival, not victory, that made them legends in the end. Now, if you've made it this far, survived the fighting, the infections, and the enthusiastic medieval surgeon with his hot knife, congratulations. You're part of an elite club of people who didn't immediately die in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, your reward isn't exactly a peaceful retirement, because now you've got to deal with the aftermath, the slow, grinding recovery in a world that doesn't really believe in rest. If you were lucky enough to be a knight or noble, you might be taken home to your manor, laid in a straw-filled bed, and cared for by servants or a local healer. The rest of the army, they were left behind, crawling through mud, hoping someone would come back. No one usually did. A hospital, if you ended up in one, wasn't the clean white building we picture today. The word actually comes from hospitality. These were places run by monks or nuns, where the goal wasn't necessarily to heal you. It was to give you comfort before you died. Beds were lined up in rows under high ceilings, candles flickering, incense masking the smell of wounds and rot. You might hear prayers more than you heard the sound of medicine. If you were one of the very lucky few who recovered enough to stand again, life after battle was quieter, but not easier. Many veterans became mercenaries, hired swords who fought in other people's wars for coin. They drifted across Europe, carrying scars and stories. Others joined religious orders, seeking forgiveness for the blood they'd spilled. And some just disappeared into villages, trying to forget. But forgetting wasn't easy. Chronic pain, infections, amputations, and trauma were lifelong companions. There was no word for PTSD back then, but it existed. They just called it melancholy or madness. A man who woke screaming from nightmares or flinched at sudden sounds might be whispered about as cursed. The medieval world understood wounds to the flesh better than wounds to the mind. Meanwhile, life for the people around the battlefield didn't stop. Peasants would creep back into burned-out villages, picking through debris for anything worth saving. Fields were ruined, livestock gone, and the air still smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Sometimes they found bodies, sometimes they found soldiers who weren't quite dead yet. Either way, it was just another day in the Middle Ages, and while all this misery unfolded, the lords and monarchs who'd ordered these battles were already moving on to plan the next one. War was seasonal work. You fought in summer, negotiated in winter, and prayed the plague didn't come around again in spring. For rulers, soldiers were numbers. For soldiers, rulers were names. Neither side fully understood the other, and yet, somehow, the system kept rolling forward. If there was any comfort, it was in the strange sense of unity that came from survival. Men who'd fought side by side shared a kind of quiet bond. They didn't talk about the worst parts, but they didn't need to. A glance, a scar, a missing hand, that was enough to tell the story. In taverns across Europe, these battered survivors gathered to drink, to forget, or just to exist among people who understood. Music, oddly enough, became medicine. Soldier songs, sometimes crude, sometimes beautiful, drifted across generations. Some sang about lost comrades, others mocked their commanders, and some just laughed at the absurdity of it all. Because when you've lived through a medieval battlefield, dark humor is sometimes all you have left. And that, in its own way, was the essence of the medieval spirit, endurance through absurdity. They didn't always win, or heal, or even understand why they kept going, but they did. Through superstition, through pain, through endless wars and endless prayers. In the end, survival in the Middle Ages wasn't about glory or strength. It was about patience, about stubbornly continuing to breathe in a world that constantly tried to take that breath away. By now, it's safe to say you've survived the worst, the fighting, the infections, the aftermath, and somehow the medieval medical system. But before you start celebrating, it's worth remembering that even if you made it home alive, peace in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly peaceful. You might think a medieval soldier's biggest problem after war would be his wounds, but no, it was unemployment. The king no longer needed your sword, and the Lord, who once promised eternal gratitude, now pretended not to know your name. Thousands of armed, restless, hungry men wandered across Europe, forming bands of mercenaries or, when desperate, just turning to banditry. After all, robbing travelers was technically still using your combat skills. Meanwhile, villagers struggled under the weight of endless warfare. Taxes had gone up, crops had gone down, and famine wasn't a what-if. It was a seasonal event. Peasants lived in constant fear of raids, disease, or just bad luck. If the soldiers didn't get you, the winter might. And remember, hygiene was still more of a suggestion than a habit. After a war, water sources were often polluted with the remains of battle. Imagine trying to rebuild your farm when the local well is half full of mud, debris, and the occasional former soldier. You'd boil water if you had firewood, but mostly, you just hoped for the best. The psychological scars lingered too. Villages filled with widows, orphans, and men who'd seen too much. Churches preached about redemption, but even priests couldn't make sense of so much death. Some people turned to faith even harder. Pilgrimages, relics, and flagellation became coping mechanisms. Others turned away entirely, convinced God had stopped listening. The nobility, of course, experienced all of this differently. For them, war was a family business, a way to gain land, titles, and political leverage. When one campaign ended, they immediately began plotting the next. Their armor was polished, their banners repainted, their chroniclers ready to write the next glorious victory. Meanwhile, the peasants who dug the graves of the last battle just sighed and got ready to do it all again. And through it all, medieval warfare kept evolving, very slowly, and often painfully. Chainmail gave way to plate armor. Swords were joined by longbows, then by gunpowder. Each innovation made killing a little easier and survival a little harder. The battlefield became louder, dirtier, and even more chaotic. Still, even in this brutality, there were rules, or at least, the illusion of them. Knights talked endlessly about chivalry, though the actual practice of it was flexible. The idea was that noblemen should fight with honor and spare civilians, but reality was far less poetic. Looting was basically part of the paycheck. Ransoms were more profitable than mercy. And if you were a common soldier, no one expected you to play fair anyway. Despite all this, there's something strangely human about how people adapted. In every army, someone cooked, someone sang, someone carved wooden charms for luck. In between slaughter and chaos, they found small rituals to remind themselves they were still people, not just weapons. And maybe that's what made them endure. The quiet, stubborn will to find fragments of normal life in the middle of madness, to laugh at bad food, to argue about the weather, to pray before battle, and then again afterward, even if both prayers sounded a little different. It's easy for us, centuries later, to see medieval war as distant and foreign, all iron and mud and superstition, but at its core, it was still full of the same fragile, messy humanity we recognize in ourselves. People afraid of dying, desperate to live, clinging to scraps of meaning in a world that didn't offer many. And that's the secret of surviving a medieval battlefield. Not strength, not skill, but sheer, unrelenting willpower. The kind that doesn't ask why, because there's no answer. It just keeps going anyway. And maybe that's what really separates us from the people of the Middle Ages, not their courage, but their tolerance for misery. Because let's be honest, most of us today wouldn't last a single afternoon in their world. We complain if the Wi-Fi goes out for 10 minutes. They spent entire winters eating boiled grain and hoping the plague skipped their village this time. Imagine trying to get comfortable in a world with no painkillers, no soap, and no concept of personal space. You sleep on straw that hasn't been changed in months, share a room with livestock, and wake up every morning to the sound of someone sharpening something. That's before breakfast, which, if you're lucky, is a small hunk of bread that tastes faintly of smoke and dirt. And yet, they survived. They built cathedrals that still stand, wrote poetry that still hurts, and fought wars that still echo in our history books. Somewhere between the mud and the miracles, They carved out entire civilizations. But before we give them too much credit, it's worth remembering that medieval warfare wasn't all noble bravery and iron will. Most of it was paperwork. Well, parchment work. Behind every heroic battle was an army of scribes, accountants, and tax collectors. War needed money, and money needed records. You'd have royal clerks meticulously listing every arrow, every horse, every bucket of ale, and God help you if you lost a receipt. The logistics of it all were almost comical. Imagine trying to coordinate tens of thousands of people without phones, radios, or even consistent maps. Messages were carried by riders who sometimes just didn't come back. Supplies got lost, weather ruined plans, and half your army might wander off before the enemy even appeared. And when they did appear, there was always that awkward moment when both sides realized they didn't actually want to die that day. Many battles ended with both armies just staring at each other across a field until one side quietly went home. Heroic epics rarely mention that part, the waiting, the boredom, the dysentery. Speaking of which, let's talk about that enemy of every medieval soldier, dysentery. You could survive an entire war and still be taken down by bad water or spoiled rations. Whole armies were defeated not by swords but by stomachs. Chroniclers loved to write about noble charges and gallant deaths. But most casualties came from something much less glamorous, diarrhea. And yet, in some grim, collective way, it all worked. Kingdoms rose, empires expanded, and the machinery of medieval war kept grinding forward. There was always another feud, another crusade, another reason to grab a sword and hope for divine favor. Even religion, the comforting constant of medieval life, couldn't resist getting involved. Every army claimed God was on its side. Priests blessed weapons, monks prayed for victory, and banners bore holy symbols like spiritual insurance policies. The irony, of course, was that both sides said the same thing. Apparently, God was very indecisive in the 14th century. Still, for all its absurdity, there was something profoundly unifying about it. On the battlefield, titles blurred. A peasant might save a nobleman's life. A nobleman might die in the mud next to a beggar. For a brief, chaotic moment, everyone was equal, in fear, in blood, in exhaustion. When the fighting ended, they'd go home, or what was left of home, carrying scars that no one really talked about. PTSD didn't have a name yet, but it had faces. The haunted look of men who'd seen too much. The quiet prayers of women waiting for husbands who'd never return. And as strange as it sounds, that's how civilizations rebuilt themselves. Not through victory, but through endurance, by just surviving long enough to try again tomorrow. So, if you're still imagining yourself on that medieval battlefield, sword in hand, armor gleaming, don't. You wouldn't last a minute, not because you're weak, but because they were built for a world that no longer exists. One where survival wasn't just a skill, it was an art form. And yet, even in all that mud, misery, and noise, the medieval battlefield had its strange kind of beauty, the sort you only notice centuries later, when you're not the one covered in grime and terror. Picture it. The sunrise glinting off 1,000 helmets. The distant sound of horns, banners fluttering like wounded birds in the wind, the air thick with anticipation, sweat, and the metallic temps of armor baking under the sun. It was chaos disguised as ceremony. Every noble believed they were part of something grand and eternal, a divine tapestry of destiny. In reality, most were about to trip on a root and suffocate in their own helmets. But they tried, and that's what's weirdly admirable about them. Even when things went horribly wrong, and they usually did, they clung to the idea that dying for a cause meant something. Whether it was for their king, their god, or just the hope of being remembered in a song. They walked straight into fear with an almost naive certainty. And make no mistake, the songs lied. Troubadours back home would spin tales of valor and glory, of knights shining under heaven's light. Meanwhile, the real survivors limped back, missing an arm, a sense of smell, and probably a few teeth. No one wrote ballads about infection or the endless cough from breathing campfire smoke for weeks. Still, the songs mattered. They softened the edges. gave purpose to pain, and helped everyone pretend that war was something noble instead of something necessary. And for medieval people, pretending was a survival tool. They didn't have the luxury of disillusionment. If you stopped believing, you stopped moving. Even the weapons had stories. Every sword had a name. Every bow had a legend. Every piece of armor was passed down like a cursed family heirloom. Some were said to be blessed, others haunted, and most were just practical, heavy, clunky, but dependable. It's funny how people in that era trusted their gear more than they trusted their kings. And then there were the horses, the real heroes of medieval combat. They carried men twice their size into impossible situations, often terrified, but still charging forward because they were trained not to stop. When the knights fell, it was usually the horses that died first, tangled in the mess of armor and mud. And yet, no one ever sang for them. They were just property, forgotten even by the chroniclers who loved to romanticize everything else. As the centuries passed, the battlefield itself began to change. Plate armor got thicker, bows got deadlier, and someone eventually decided to add gunpowder to the mix. That was when the idea of chivalry really started to die, because once you could kill a knight with a trigger pull, instead of a sword swing, all that honor talk suddenly seemed optional. Gunfire didn't care about lineage or courage. It flattened everyone equally. And slowly, the old world started fading, not with a scream, but with a quiet bang. Those who lived through it must have sensed a shift. The age of gleaming armor and sacred oaths was turning into something colder, more mechanical. The battlefield was no longer about individual glory. It was about efficiency. Numbers, logistics, precision. The poetry drained out, replaced by strategy. But for all the evolution, one thing never changed: the fear. The sound of battle might have modernized, but that ancient, stomach-dropping terror stayed the same. Whether it was arrows or bullets, swords or shrapnel, the feeling of standing in that line, heart hammering, waiting for the world to explode around you, was timeless. And that's the haunting thread connecting every era of warfare. Technology changes, ideologies shift, but fear remains the one true constant. It's what ties us back to those muddy, medieval fields, to the knights, the peasants, and the unlucky foot soldiers who didn't want to be there any more than we would. They fought because they had to. We remember them because we don't have to. And maybe that's the only real progress humanity's ever made. So here we are, standing on the edge of a quiet battlefield. Centuries later, the clanging armor has rusted into dust, the banners have rotted away, and the songs of glory have long stopped echoing. All that's left is the silence, and a faint memory of what it meant to be human when the world demanded you be more than that. If you could walk across one of those old fields now, Agincourt, Hastings, Bannockburn, you'd see nothing but grass and sky. But beneath your feet, deep in the soil, are traces of it all. Fragments of armor, broken arrowheads, the faint scars of trenches and footprints, long washed away. Each one belongs to someone who thought, at least for a moment, that their name might matter. The truth is, medieval warfare wasn't about courage or cowardice. It was about survival, trying to stay alive for one more minute, one more breath, one more swing. It didn't matter if you were a knight or a peasant. Once the chaos began, titles meant nothing. Mud equalized everyone. And yet, in that mess, something strangely human endured. People still helped each other. A dying soldier might whisper a prayer for his enemy. A squire might drag his master to safety, even as arrows rained down. The battlefield was supposed to erase compassion, but somehow it always leaked back in. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That even in the ugliest moments of history, kindness still found a way to exist. Quiet, trembling, but real. Because if we're honest, none of us would have lasted a minute out there. Not with our soft hands, our coffee habits, our back pain from sitting too long. We're creatures of comfort now. But the people of the Middle Ages, they were built from something rougher, a kind of resilience we can barely imagine. They endured famine, plague, and endless war, yet still found time to build cathedrals, paint icons, and write poetry about love. They weren't just surviving. They were insisting on meaning. And that's what makes them feel so hauntingly close to us. Not their swords or banners, but their refusal to give up beauty in a world that kept trying to destroy it. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a place of death. It was a reflection of life, unpredictable, brutal, and sometimes darkly absurd. You could be trampled by a horse or blessed by luck in the same heartbeat. You could rise from the mud one day and be buried in it the next. And still, people went on. When you strip away the armor, the fear, and the songs, all that remains is the human noise underneath it, the heartbeat that has been echoing through history ever since. So maybe, in some strange way, we owe those medieval warriors more than we realize. They didn't just fight for kings or land. They fought through chaos so that, eventually, someone could stand in the quiet afterward and tell their story. And here we are, hundreds of years later, still whispering their names in the dark, not because they were heroes, but because they remind us what endurance looks like. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the battlefields fade. Picture the grass growing back over the mud, the sky clearing after the smoke, the armor gone, the noise gone, just the sound of wind across an empty field. History has gone quiet now. The knights are asleep, the banners have fallen, but somewhere, deep in the earth, the echo of that courage still hums, faint, steady, eternal. And that's enough. Now rest easy, traveler. The war is over.